Hello. I'm going to talk to you now about some verse forms that you can experiment with. We can think of these as standardized patterns a poem can use. Now, the world of poetry has a large number of these verse forms, but because none of us wants an hour-long lecture, we'll just look at a couple of them right now. And we'll start with a form you've seen before, the sonnet, a form which we often see in poems of love or devotion. As a good example of this form, we can look at Claude McKay's poem, America, written in 1922. As we examine this poem, we can see a few aspects that make it a sonnet. First, we can notice that the poem gives us 14 lines. This length seems to mostly define a sonnet. If we see a poem of 14 lines, even if it doesn't have any of the other characteristics of a sonnet, we generally think of the poem as sonnet-like. So we bring to the poem the expectations we bring to a sonnet. Now, we might also observe the poem's rhyme scheme. To do that, let's label the way the rhymes appear. So notice the rhymes in lines 1 and 3, which we'll label as A, and the rhymes in lines 2 and 4, which we'll label B. Then we can see this pattern with new rhymes in the next 4 lines, and in the 4 lines following those, followed finally by a pair of rhymes at the end. This rhyme scheme breaks the poem into sections, and this kind of sectional division by rhyme scheme also indicates a sonnet. This tends to give the sonnet a feel of kind of a statement of philosophy. It moves from section to section, carrying a reader's thought along to that final couplet that indicates the end of the thought. The 14-line length and this distinctive sectional rhyme scheme serve as particular characteristics of this kind of sonnet. As you read more sonnets, you might notice how this form of organization lends itself to particular ways of looking at or thinking about a subject. The form of the sonnet itself wants to give you a clue as to how the poem wants you to see its subject. In fact, in general, the form of a poem can give us very strong clues about what the poem wants to say to us. And this is why we help ourselves as readers when we can recognize and think about the effect of these standardized patterns of verse forms. And we can see a slightly more complicated verse form by looking at Villanelle's. This form works on the principle of giving lines new contexts as they develop through their poem. This is kind of complicated. You'll see what I mean in this poem by Elizabeth Bishop, titled One Art, and written in 1976. As we read, you'll probably notice how the first line of this poem repeats itself regularly. You could also notice how the meaning of the line changes a little bit each time you see it. And then you might notice a further repetition, more varied than the repetition of the first line. This kind of repetition of lines is characteristic of the Villanelle. It shows us the way that repetition in new contexts can add meaning to this pattern of repetition. The mention of disaster seems to change throughout the poem, but it also seems paired with that idea of the art of losing. And so as we keep looking at the poem, we can see how the idea keeps reappearing and developing in our minds. Poems of this form work by exploiting the way that what we see near a word helps determine how we understand the word. This is what we mean when we say context. Thus, our experience of the poem, our experience of this Villanelle in particular, depends on how we understand it as we move through time within it. And I'll leave it to you to have ideas about how the rhyme scheme works to continue the idea of repetition in the Villanelle. I hope that this look at a couple of verse forms has inspired you to look more closely at the way in which poetry can express its feelings and ideas, not just through the words it says, but also through the way it arranges those words into patterns of rhyme and of repetition. As you keep exploring poetry, you might look into the great number of various verse forms available to both readers and writers. As you look at more of them as a reader, you might feel inspired to experiment with more of them as a writer and see what these verse forms do to affect the ideas that you have and the feelings that you want to express. As always, thank you for your time and attention.